globalist, liberal elite traitors, racists, Little Englanders, jingoists. This, unfortunately, has become the traction of political debate in Britain these days. So today is October the 31st, 2019, Halloween. It was supposed to be Brexit Day today, and of course that hasn't happened. Now, let me just say from the outset, I can totally understand the anger many Leave voters will feel. Deep anger. They are going to feel that Brexit hasn't been delivered and it's a betrayal. I get it. But I am getting increasingly worried about just how deep the divisions are in this country. Thankfully, there hasn't been that much actual violence. But the fact that this sort of discourse is being normalised, the fact that so many people have a knee-jerk reaction when they hear an opposite opinion on Brexit is deeply alarming. I've just watched an interview with John Major, former Prime Minister. Now, someone like that is never ever going to appeal to Leave people because they're convinced he's a Europhile, he's sceptical of Brexit. So no matter what he says, no matter what someone like that says, the knee-jerk response is going to be, oh, he's a saboteur, he's a traitor, he's X, Y and Z. And there will be equivalents on the other side. There will be Leave MPs who make very valid arguments, and some Remainers will immediately have a knee-jerk response to them. I'm not going to pretend I'm totally on the fence with this. I voted Remain, and I am very, very sceptical of Brexit. I struggle to see what good it will do the country. Saying taking back control is very vague unless you actually outline what that means. And I've seen very little clarification. I've seen very little actual evidence to show that Brexit will be wonderful for this country. There's a lot of promises that have been broken by Leave leaders. And I do think that the voters were largely misled, but I also think that when you have a referendum, you have to uphold it. You know, voters are adults. The way I see it is they voted Leave. If it's going to be a massive mistake, then that was their choice. And they were the majority. So that's the democratic side of me. We have to uphold that. But this thing has just dragged on for 3 years. It's been an absolute nightmare for this country. It reminds me of Watergate, not in the sense that it's a scandal exactly, but remember when Gerald Ford became president, he said our long national nightmare is over. But Brexit's going to last longer than the implications of Watergate on America. I mean, that had a hugely damaging effect on American public confidence. I would say this is even deeper in Britain. It's bigger than Watergate in terms of the effect it's having on this country. So you may think that having voted Remain, I would like the fact that there's been yet another extension. Believe it or not, I don't. What I want more than anything is for the dust to settle to some extent. I'm not so naive to believe that the day we come out, looks like it's going to be January now, everything will just sort itself out. I think, unfortunately, the divisions are going to rumble on for years, and that is an utter tragedy. That is an utter tragedy. Because I think a lot of people on both sides will point to David Cameron for calling the referendum, particularly on the Remain side. Whilst I'm critical of whilst I do believe that it was part of an internal Tory schism, I do think that it was probably inevitable at some point, so I wouldn't blame Cameron too much. I think at some point UKIP would have galvanised the pressure for a referendum to be held. And the Lib Dems had called for it previously, so it's not, it wasn't just Cameron's decision to do that. But what we need to do is, we hear a lot about MPs being abused. My position on that is they need tough skin, you need to be able to take strong criticism in politics, but the personalised abuse, particularly female MPs, rape threats and so on, is absolutely disgusting. Yelling in people's faces, this goes beyond dissent. There is, when, and it's both sides. Jacob Rees-Mogg recently was walking with his young son. Some may say it was a stunt, whatever. It's irrelevant, because those Remain protesters who were yelling at him, I condemn that. But I would like to see... I will say I think moderate Remainers have been more quick to condemn the extremes in their midst than reasonable Leave people have to condemn the extremes in their midst. What I mean by that is, I know lots of reasonable Leave people who are very frustrated and they want out, but they recognise that there are red lines in terms of abuse, but they're not really recognising that there are extremes in their midst. They just say, oh well, I don't agree with what those people are doing, but they're angry. I even saw someone say that if there's riots on the streets, well, it's come to that. Someone on a mutual forum that I'm on, oh well, they've no other choice. You always have a choice whether to riot or not. Always. Being angry isn't an excuse. I feel very angry about a lot of issues, but I don't go out and set a car on fire. Everyone has responsibility for their own actions, and I think part of the problem with Brexit is it's giving people an excuse on both sides. On both sides. It's giving people an excuse to behave in a way that they wouldn't have done so before. To talk in a way they wouldn't have done so before. In a democracy, you're going to have robust debate, that's fine. And it's going to be heated, that's always been the way. But there is something uniquely nasty about this period. I would say this even transcends the 1980s with all the social divisions in the Thatcher era. I would say this probably even goes beyond that, because the social divisions in Thatcher's Britain was in a large way geographical. Where you had whole communities who felt a certain way. With this, it's okay, you had Leave voting seats, but even within strong Leave seats or strong Remain seats, there's dissenting views that are very vocal as well. So it's just toxic. I just think that people need to check themselves. They need to think, how am I communicating here? Am I just making my point? Am I just making valid arguments? Or am I just vilifying the other side for the sake of it? So if your knee-jerk response to a Remain MP is to call them a globalist elite traitor, that is not an argument. It's just not. You can say you don't like them, you can say their argument's not valid, but this sort of knee-jerk mentality, that is a very inflammatory thing to call anyone. And as far as I'm concerned, something like that really demands strong evidence. But there's no longer an onus on people to provide evidence for these smears. And it goes the other way when certain Remainers just come out with racists, there's a racist thing. I think there is a racist component among Leave voters, I do. There won't be a single nationalist in this country or far-right person who voted Remain. So it is a domain, that hardcore of racism is much more a domain of the Leave side. That's just a fact. But it doesn't mean that all Leavers think that way. But, I have to say, I've repeatedly seen, or I've consistently seen, Remain MPs say, we know not all Leave people are racist. But the divisions are so toxic that people automatically think, oh well, they're calling us all racists. But they're not. At least not always. Having said that, there are Remainers who jump to that, and I'm talking particularly about the protesters. You get that idiot Steve Bray with his loudspeaker. A man like that is not, you can't compromise with him. He's an extremist because he has tunnel vision. He would be a good example. I, as a Remain voter, am calling out Steve Bray. He's an extremist, because anyone who doesn't agree with him is a fascist, according to Steve Bray. I'm talking about the guy that's always wearing the EU thing and he's got the loudspeaker. He also can give, but he can't take. You know, he interrupts people's interviews, but then when his is interrupted, oh, that's a different matter. So I totally understand Leavers being pissed off with him. But there are equivalents on the Leave side who are very intolerant and who just have this knee-jerk response. If you disagree with them, you're a traitor. I've been called a traitor, right? For making videos similar to this one. I've had messages like, tell the truth, centrist philosopher, you're a traitor and you hate this country. Just as a matter of record, you come out with that crap on my channel, I'll kick you right off. I don't have to put up with that. But this is just the mentality that we're facing in this country right now, and it's driving families apart, it's driving communities apart. It's just tragic, and people just need to step back and think we need some sense of moderation here. I'm not saying people should be nice and calm and sit down with a cup of tea, because there are real frustrations, but we need some moderation. Otherwise, I fear we are going to see more political assassinations like Joe Cox, and that isn't hot air. It isn't, because there has been violent threats. I mean, there was a Leave site recently that called for, on GoFundMe, to assassinate Gina Miller. Now, thankfully, it didn't get any money, so I guess most people, even if they agreed with the site, weren't going to risk the legal consequences of that. It's right, by the way, that that's being investigated. But the threats have went both ways. I mean, the experience that Jacob Rees-Mogg went through, that was a disgrace. And he's frequently been the target of that sort of vitriolic. I don't particularly care for Jacob Rees-Mogg. He's a true blue Tory. You know, I take big issue with many of his policy areas. I think it's legitimate for people to hate him, hate his policies, but don't target him when he's with his young son. Everyone needs to just step back. There is real anger in this country, and by the way, the Leave side think they have a monopoly on anger. I said I'm not sitting on the fence, and I will state my opinion. Respectfully to Leave people, you're not the only ones who are angry. A lot of Remain people feel very angry because a lot of Remain people see it as all these divisions, all this toxicity would never have happened if that referendum had never have happened. You know, Remainers didn't want this situation. No Remain person wanted this situation where we would be this bitterly divided. And I suppose the counter-argument there would be, oh well, it's the Remainers are putting up a bar to Brexit. If they wouldn't do that, then it would settle down by now. But I'm not convinced of that. I think even when we leave, the tensions are going to remain, unfortunately. So with all that said, that's why I actually welcome this general election. There's going to be nastiness in it, for sure. But when the votes come through, it will present a much clearer picture of where we stand. Because right now it's just everyone is divided. The Tory party is divided, Labour's divided, the public's divided. Even the second referendum, people are divided among themselves. Everyone is divided. I bet the Brexit party is divided among themselves. So I'm not naive. I'm not going to say people should just not have strong feelings on this, because it affects our entire future as a country. But if people don't start acknowledging that there are extremes on both sides, and they don't distance themselves from that, then we've got a very serious problem here, because it's just going to get deeper. People are going to not trust each other. People are going to cut off friends, maybe even family members, over this. It's absolutely toxic. And what we need to do is just guard ourselves and call out the extremes in our midst. So as a Remain voter, I believe I have a responsibility to call out Remain extremes, like I'm doing with those who targeted Jacob Rees-Mogg. That's what I'm doing. But I would like to see Leave people also do that. I would like to see them, for example, unreservedly condemn that petition to kill Gina Miller. And I don't see much of that from Leave voters, from Leave MPs maybe, but not Leave voters. Where are the Leave voters condemning that petition? So there is responsibility on both sides. Last point, if you voted leave, I totally get it. There's a lot of things about the European Union I don't like. I don't think it's a particularly democratic organisation. And yeah, I get it. I really do. But please recognise that there are extremes in your midst. And I say to my fellow Remain voters, we also need to recognise that there are extremes in our midst. People who just come out with, I mean, the likes of Steve Bray is an example of that. And there's others. I mean, no one can accuse me of not being consistent. So I sleep well in myself. I feel I've approached Brexit in the most responsible way I can. Yeah, I voted Remain, but I don't hate Leave people. I don't believe they're all fascists or racists. Most of them aren't. But I would also like to see perhaps a little bit more traction on the Leave side to call out the extremes in their midst. I do think that is lacking. I mean, where's the condemnation from Leave voters? I mean, Leave MPs maybe will condemn it because they're in the public eye, they have to, but I mean, that's the thing, when you get people like Mark Francois using hyperbole, saying, for example, the country would explode today. He's a parliamentarian. He should know better. He's in a position of power, of responsibility. And the press have responsibility. When the tabloids stir up hatred against Remain MPs, or when the left-wing equivalents stir up contempt for Remainers like Nigel Farage, for Leave people like Nigel Farage, and they do, everyone has responsibility. Politicians have responsibility, the press has responsibility. I mean, I would particularly accuse the tabloid press of showing no responsibility on this. I mean, the way they casually call Remain MPs traitors is disgusting. And then, you know something, if one of those Remain MPs was assassinated, they would cry crocodile tears the following day, like they done with Jo Cox. I mean, I don't like always invoking Jo Cox because it sounds like it's kind of using her death, but there has been threats against other MPs, and it's not hot air. I think there is real threats out there. So, I just conclude with saying, really, whatever side of this you're on, just recognise that there are extremes in your midst. Call them out, distance yourself from it. It's not good enough to say, oh well, I don't agree with that, but just stay silent. You need to condemn it. So I urge Leave people, condemn that petition against Gina Miller. You may not like Gina Miller, you may think she's anti-democratic, you may think a lot of things, but it cannot be acceptable to publicly try and invoke an assassination against a public figure. That cannot be responsible. It cannot be civil. If you think she's broken the law in some way, if you think that she's a bad person, by all means criticise her, but really, people just need to recognise what's going on here, be responsible for their own views and attitudes. I try to be, and I know others do, but I wish more people would, because extreme views are now being normalised, and that's because a lot of people will say, oh well, it's just a petition, they don't really mean it, but they do. Whoever set that up, I'm sure seriously considered it. That's why it's right that there's a police investigation, and there should be on the other side as well. If violent threats are made against Leave MPs, that should also be investigated. I don't think it's good enough to say, oh, I was a bit angry and I lost my temper. Everyone's responsible for their own words. I felt furious at times, but I would never ever threaten to kill someone. Even if I felt like it, I wouldn't be stupid enough to do it online. We all have responsibility.